It was supposed to be just another routine mission. A makeshift crew of 6 Canadian airmen flying over the Burmese jungle in 1945, dropping rice and flour to the villagers below. The oldest was a farmer's son from Dutchess, Alberta. He was 26. The youngest was also a farm kid from Campbellville, Ontario. He was just 20. They'd flown a lot of trips like this. So far, they'd been lucky. This time, their luck would run out. Within the next hour, somewhere over the jungle, the 2 farm boys and the 4 other airmen would disappear without a trace, just weeks before the Japanese surrender. When that surrender did come, these 6 simply got overlooked in the excitement. The war was over. Their comrades were ordered home. There would be no continuing search. All that would be known for sure was that the crew of KN 563 would be forever missing in action. But for their lovers, for their families, for the one baby son left behind, there would always be a question, always a nagging doubt. For over 50 years, a continuing sense that there was something left undone. No final closure. "45,000 Canadians died in the Second World War, 45,000 who were suddenly no more. But to the families who mourned for them, it wasn't 45,000 soldiers, sailors, and aircrew who were lost. It was somebody's son, somebody's lover, a father, a brother. Flight Sergeant Peter McLaren was 20 years old when the plane went down in Burma. But it is not a flight sergeant that his sister Eleanor remembers.
We always felt that he was the most loved and favored in the family, just because of the way he was. He was such a kind, caring boy, and he grew up to be that way. When he wasn't working in the farm, he worked down here at the lumber mill, and he was such a caring person. He bought, with his first paycheck from the lumber mill, he bought my sister a girl's bike. My younger sister, she was like 7 years younger than him. He had never had a bicycle, and I had never had a bicycle. So the thing for him to do was to buy her one, you see.
The pilot that day was 22-year-old Warrant Officer Bill Rogers from 21 Vernon Street in Halifax. He was the eldest of 3 boys, big brother to Don Rogers.
When I think of Bill, I think about the things that we did as boys, how he taught me how to swim, how he taught me how to carry a rifle and skin a rabbit, and fishing together, and all the things that we did as brothers will do. Those are the things that I think of. And if we got out of line with, either my younger brother or I, we got out of line with our parents, we heard from Bill. I mean, he was the disciplinarian. And no, we were always very proud of him and respected him.
22-year-old Jimmy Cox from Beresford, Manitoba, was the wireless operator. He had just received word that he had become a father. How Jimmy took the news of the birth is still imprinted on the memory of his wartime comrade, Glenn Lynham.
He was completely delighted, and as we were. He just couldn't talk enough about this son who he planned on seeing, of course, when he got back to England. But it just wasn't to be. It's one of the tragedies of the air.
In Europe, after 6 years of terror, the carnage was finally over, and people on both sides were gathering to celebrate the peace. In the Pacific, the atomic bomb at Hiroshima, which would finally end the Second World War, was now only 6 weeks away. And in the forgotten front in Burma, the fighting was slowly winding down. The Canadian air transport crews who had been dropping supplies for the British 14th Army were now spending most of their time dropping food for the war-ravaged Burmese. 435 Squadron was assigned to this humanitarian effort. Bob Craig was one of their pilots.
We used to drop rice to our own troops, and we dropped it to the natives and everything else. And it was usually in about 60-pound bags, you know. You dropped them at a certain level. If you were dropping rice and sugar and stuff like that, heavens alive, it looked like it snowed down there. Everybody went back there. The co-pilot went back, and the wireless operator, navigator, everybody went back there. And I just ring the bell and get the aircraft in a down position so the stuff didn't get hung up on the tailplane. And they got it out in a hurry.
Leading aircraftsman Cornelius Kopp was a Mennonite whose parents had escaped the Russian Revolution and settled on a farm near Dutchess, Alberta. He had volunteered to go on the fatal flight and help offload the rice and flour. In Dutchess, he is still remembered as a caring and sensitive big brother who, even in the middle of a war, took time to write his 10-year-old sister, Hilda.
I used to have an autograph book, and being he wasn't home at the time, I asked him to send me something, which he did. And of course, we never knew where he was, so he wrote this somewhere in England, of course, at the time. It's dated March the 22nd, 1944, and it says, "Dear Hilda, here's hoping that never again in your lifetime may you see a world torn asunder in strife and bloodshed, so that all your days will be so happy and carefree as they are now. Your brother, Cornelius." This has meant an awful lot to me. It's something that I'll cherish all my life. You can see it in there, you just tell what kind of a person he was. He was concerned about everybody.
The all-volunteer crew had been sent to England for training before being assigned to the Pacific. Pilot Officer Bill Kyle from Perth, Ontario, was stationed in the seaside town of Bournemouth. And it was here, on the beaches and in the gardens, that he started courting young Betty Burkle.
I first met Bill Kyle in the Bournemouth Gardens in April 1944. He was walking along a path, and I was sat on the grass with a friend, and he walked past, and our eyes just met, and we just followed sort of one another with our eyes. And then he sort of stood over there for quite a while, debating whether to come over or not. And then he came over and said, "I'm Bill Kyle. What's your name? Do you go to college?" etc. We were engaged on his 21st birthday. I was 18 and he was 21. All the Canadians that were stationed in Bournemouth during the war, they were then posted to different areas, and he asked me which he should go in. And I didn't tell him, and he kept asking, what shall I go in? And so I didn't know what to do, so I asked my mother, and my mother said, well, the safest is transport. So I said, what about transport? And then he went into Dakotas into transport.
Betty Burkle would become a lifelong friend of Bill Kyle's family in Canada, and in the quiet moments for the rest of her life would wonder what might have happened if the man she was going to marry hadn't taken her mother's advice. Normally, the airmen stayed as a unit, but it was not unusual for makeshift crews to be thrown together. This was one of those crews. Co-pilot Bill Kyle volunteered because he was trying to complete his tour of duty, get in his 700 flying hours. That way, he could go back to Bournemouth and to the girl he was going to marry. Jimmy Cox wanted to increase his flying hours, so he too could get time away from the front and visit the new son he so desperately wanted to see. Just days earlier, Jimmy and Glenn Lynham had posed for a photograph to send home. Their friendship was typical of the bonds that developed in the wartime jungle. There were 500 Canadian airmen assigned to the Burma campaign, members of the RCAF's 435 and 436 squadrons. The Dakotas they flew in, DC-3s converted to handle cargo, were the workhorses of the Canadian Air Force. As pilot Bob Craig remembers, the men had become a close-knit group.
We used to fly one day and rest the next. And we used to play cards and one thing and another like that. We lived down in a little camp. Like they even called it Camp Pizpoor. And we moved from there up on the hill when the monsoon really started, the 24th of May. And we lived in these kind of bamboo huts. And they were, well, there was rats crawling around on the walls, and there was all kinds of little animals and all kinds of bugs, big crawlers and everything else was around. The odd little snake and stuff like that. Yeah. Dehydrated hash, corned beef and cabbage. You get fed up with one, you go back to the other. And if your stomach was good strong, you'd eat that curry and rice those natives used to cook up out there and burn your insides out. Well, it was grim.
Cornelius Kopp had volunteered to come on the flight as a spare loader and collect the extra few cents they got paid for every hour spent in the air. He was still sending money home to the farm in Alberta. The pilot, Bill Rogers, was short a few flying hours and wanted to make them up so he could end his current tour of duty with his regular crew. They were all experienced flyers, but this was the height of the monsoon season. They took off in 10-minute intervals. The plane to leave after KN 563 was captained by Bob Craig.
But I do remember there was a monsoon cloud on my left side because we were going that way. And believe you me, it was plenty rough. And the plane just started to go up, and there's nothing you could do to stop it from going up. And then all of a sudden, down it would go. And then when it hit it, you'd swear you'd hit the ground so hard, you know. Half a dozen times during our tour of operations, I made forced landings to get away from them monsoons.
There's storms everywhere, and you're flying between them and around them, and they're towering up to 30 and 40,000 feet. And if you ever get into one, they'll just tear you apart. And so it's a violent time. Your aircraft is just shaking. You have to strap yourselves in quite often because of the violence of the air. Sometimes when you land, you could hardly stand because you come out of the wild air. Unbelievable storms. They're beyond the imagination. And that's probably what caught young Bill.
Bill's last letter that he actually wrote to me, and this was a week before they went down, and he mentioned the monsoons there. If you're like, this is dated June 4th. And he's saying, some family things, and then he says, the weather's no screaming hell, though, and flying through a monsoon is something you only want to do once in a lifetime. Honest, Don, they're grim. If it was just rain, it wouldn't be too bad. But those damn clouds have so many winds and air currents going in about 80 different ways that it's only by the grace of God that the wings stay on.
Bill Rogers' regular crew had been scheduled for a short leave to the northern Punjab. When Rogers and Jimmy Cox decided to make up the extra flying hours instead, Glenn Lynham and the others went to the bar in Chukalala without them.
And during the evening, while we were maybe hooping it up a bit, along came a Swami, a fortune teller, an Indian, and nobody would let him tell their fortune. So I suppose I felt sorry for the chap, and I gave him his 2 rupees and said, well, go ahead. And he told me a good many things that have come true in my life, absolutely amazing. And then he got a strange look on his face. And he said, your crew are not all here. And I said, well, how would you know that? Well, he said, I know. He said, 2 of you are missing. And he said, I have some bad news for you. He said, you'll never see them again. And I said, oh, go on. How would you know a thing like that? Well, he said, I see it. And he went on and he finished my fortune telling. And I was quite skeptical about the whole thing. But later on, when I walked into the mess and saw the look on the faces of the men, I knew right then that he was right, that something had happened.
At the base camp, they were devastated by the news. These weren't men who gave up their lives in battle. They died delivering food. They would be among the last Canadians to die in the Second World War. Their comrades tried to figure out where to look for them, knowing that half the crew never had to be on that flight.
We looked for them for days and couldn't find them. They didn't seem to be on the track that they were supposed to be. Had we even suspected that they were off track, we might have discovered some sign, but in that jungle it's impossible. Yeah, absolutely impossible. It's like looking for a needle under 100 haystacks.
We did take a look back on the way back and see if there was any sign of fire or anything, and I made 4 or 5 trips into that same base afterwards. And I always took a look around, but a place like that, you never saw anything.
The speculation was that the plane had been caught in a monsoon and was sent careening out of control into the jungle. It would lie undetected for half a century. And then, after all those years, a miraculous combination of luck and coincidence. A local hunter, far from his usual path, noticed sunlight glinting on a piece of metal on the jungle floor. He picked up an old watch. Weeks later, he delivered it to a local missionary who would clean it up and take it here to the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery in Rangoon. And then another remarkable coincidence. On the very day the missionary arrived with the watch, an expert in war memorabilia happened to be visiting the cemetery. She noticed the letter R stamped before the service number, which she knew identified the owner as a member of the Royal Canadian Air Force. The watch was Bill Kyle's, bought as a parting gift by his mother and his younger brother George.
My mother wanted to, naturally, well, we shared the cost, but got him a watch. He needed a watch in flying, naturally, so got him a good watch.
For the families who remained at home and worried about their sons and brothers fighting overseas during the war, the constant fear was that one day a delivery boy would arrive with a telegram that every family dreaded. And the day it came would be a day unlike any day that had gone before or any day that would follow. It would be a day of such immense sorrow that it would remain frozen for all time.
We were having supper with Mother and Dad and my younger brother, and the knock on the door, and the telegraph delivery boy came. And that's, during the war, that was a very bad thing when that telegraph boy came. So I went to the door and I got the telegram and brought it back into the kitchen. There was a look of panic in the eyes of both my parents. It's the worst day of their lives.
When the telegram was brought to our home, I remember, I can never forget my mother. It was horrific, not knowing. You know, I think had it been a body brought back, or she could have had a closure, it would have been a lot easier for her, but not knowing. So, no, I remember the day very clearly when it happened.
For their families, the telegrams announcing the 6 boys were missing in action would leave them with an ever-lingering doubt, a grasping, desperate hope.
She carried on that hope for 10, 15 years, always thinking that, well, maybe they landed in the jungle somehow and they had amnesia and they couldn't get out, and she would hear that somebody, a Japanese soldier would surrender. He'd been in the jungle for 10 years or something. And she'd say, well, maybe that could happen to Bill.
While finding an old watch in the jungle was hardly the stuff of international headlines, it was of shattering importance to the families and wartime companions who had been living with a question mark for all those years. The news would release emotions which had been kept under guard for half a century.
I found out the aircraft had been found when Kyle phoned me up and said, guess what, Betty? The plane's been found. I was absolutely elated, you know. Oh, I'm going to cry now.
I was sitting up here in the garage and I read that piece in the paper. It said airman found after 49 years. And you know, I was sitting there and I never read another line. I said, could this be Bill Rogers? And I read down, and sure enough it was. And I was sitting there holding the paper like that. I was flabbergasted.
The discovery would take Glenn Lynham back to his early navigation training, where he and his classmates were so full of hope and youth and promise.
Do you realize there were 13 degree men in that class? 13 men with degrees, university degrees. I didn't have one, but 13 of them did. Absolutely the best. Oh, marvelous men. Oh, you never forget them. I trained with 27 men, and 20 of us were lost. And I knew them all.
Bill Kyle's watch had provided a location. It was at last known where, in the dense Burmese jungle, the remains of 6 Canadian airmen lay. Now Canada, as a nation, had a duty to identify those remains, bring them out of the jungle, and finally bury them with the full military honor they deserved. But there were complications. Burma had been going through major social upheavals. The country was now also known as Myanmar. Rangoon's name had been changed to Yangon. The new military government was wary of foreigners. It would take on-again, off-again negotiations before they would agree to the Canadian mission. And even then, the recovery team would be restricted to only 3 days at the crash site. If there were retrievable remains, it was agreed that they would be interred in the Rangoon War Cemetery. Recovery team leader Phil MacDonald of Veterans Affairs would help organize the burial.
This is Chuck Chan, Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery. It's about a half an hour outside of Rangoon. Here are buried over 6,000 Commonwealth soldiers and airmen, and on these columns are over 24,000 names of people whose graves are unknown.
There are 54 Canadians buried in this cemetery, and if the mission in the jungle is a success, there will be soon 6 more. In late November 1996, a recovery team made up of volunteers from Veterans Affairs and National Defense arrived in Yangon to acclimatize themselves to the oppressive heat of the jungle. The team would be joined by Shelley Whiting from the Canadian Embassy in Bangkok, who had been instrumental in the negotiations to get them this far. In all, there would be 12, experts in jungle travel, in snakes, in survival. There would be a forensic dentist, a team doctor, photographer, wireless operator, a dozen Canadians on what was now a 51-year-old mission. Leading the team for the military would be 30-year Army veteran Major Bill Levy.
Our mission, confirmed, to recover the remains of the 6 airmen that went down in the C-47 aircraft during the war. Phase 1, we'll move out of here by helicopter to the site. Phase 2, and first in priority, we locate and recover the remains. Phase 3, recover the artifacts that we can carry back for the War Museum.
While the Myanmar government had at first seemed reluctant to help, they now announced that they had cleared a landing pad and confirmed arrangements for the Canadian team to be based in the remote northern riverbank village of Kamti, a half-hour helicopter ride from the site where the watch had been found. As the team took their first trip into the jungle, they still had little idea of what to expect. But after months of diplomatic and bureaucratic frustration, they at least knew they were finally just minutes away.
Hey, sir. Major leaving. Finally, after a year. All right. Exactly.
The arrival into the jungle was a surprise. Where they had expected dense undergrowth, there was actually a narrow but well-worn path. It was not the torturous trek they'd trained for. Warrant Officer Tim Robinson from Halifax was the first to come across what might have been a piece of KN 563.
Well, it's riveted together like it's a piece of an aircraft. I think it was the inside walls were perforated like that.
And then, in a small clearing, the obvious remains of what was once a plane. But was it the plane they were looking for? And if it was that plane, how would they possibly identify it? As they started their preliminary sifting through the wreckage, Master Warrant Officer Jim Vianot, who had served in Cyprus, the Golan Heights, and Somalia, was among the first to realize that this was not at all what they had envisioned.
What do you think, sir?
The only problem is we were expecting to find a relatively intact plane with remains outside. So what we'll have to do is use some of those bags to haul soil.
This was burnt and buried about a foot in the dirt. I said, I think that puts to rest our thoughts about there possibly being a survivor on an impact. Because she buckled pretty good. In the fire, yeah.
From the position of the pieces of wreckage on the jungle floor and the shattering of the metal frame, it becomes obvious that this plane must have hit the ground with terrifying impact and that nothing could have survived.
Have everybody put their gloves on, Sergeant Major?
Yeah, okay. Make sure everybody puts the gloves on.
Glenn Lynham has theorized for years that the violence of the monsoon storms could have ripped off a wingtip or sent the plane upside down and shaken loose the cargo. Either way, there would have been nothing the air crew could have done.
Had they been flipped over, the whole load would have dumped into the bottom of in the roof of the plane, and it would have been total chaos. There's no way they could have got out of it. No way. Once that happened, once you lost your stability and your load came loose, well, forget it.
Now that is silk. That is parachute silk. Okay, see the stitching?
Yeah.
That's because the panels are sewn together and they fly. Now whether this is or not, it could be part of a panel, but
No seam.
there's no seam.
Yeah.
There's no, like, even this still has the stitching from the seam.
The jungle recovery team worked their way through the first day, collecting and collating the obvious surface wreckage, while Don Rogers was beginning to feel a sense of relief.
When I heard that they were going to go in and make sure that the aircraft identified by the hunters was that particular aircraft. Both my younger brother and I were really pleased. It was a relief. All these years, we've always wondered what happened.
Phil MacDonald was soon able to confirm that this indeed was the wreckage of KN 563.
This is the rondelle, the marking for our Canadian planes at that time. It appears to be from the fuselage, not sure left or right side. But you can see, if you look really closely, some of the red, presumably from either the inner ring or the Canadian maple leaf, I'm not sure. The combination of this piece and this piece, which had been found earlier, also from the side of the fuselage, and later we'll try and clean a bit of it off, but KN 563. This is the airplane that we had been looking for. This is the airplane that we have.
The navigator on KN 563 was 21-year-old David Cameron from Oshawa, Ontario. He was one of 3 children, had a brother and a sister. Davy Cameron played rugby and hockey and worked as a clerk for General Motors and the Bank of Commerce. It can now be confirmed that the remains of Flying Officer Cameron and his crewmates lie here. Like the others, David Cameron had volunteered for the Air Force, caught up in the same campaign fervor that had captured the McLaren family of Campbellville.
At the time, it was, as I said, the thing to do was to join up and be patriotic. The King and Queen had crossed this country, and we had got out with our little flags and we'd waved them. But they were trying to get people to join up, and that was 1939. I stood out there myself and waved a flag at them.
When the war started, Bill Kyle had been working in his uncle's construction business in Toronto. Unknown to Bill, his uncle had applied for a draft exemption for him, claiming his nephew's job already qualified as part of the war effort. When Bill Kyle found out he could be exempt from fighting, he applied to join the Air Force.
Needless to say, his uncle wasn't very happy. But he wanted to fly, and he wanted to be an engineer, which he studied.
The Burmese, who had been assigned to guide and observe the recovery mission, were concerned that the Canadians weren't eating properly, and on the second day offered to share their lunch of freshly caught monkey. The recovery team decided to stick with their K-rations, much to the amusement of the Burmese. By now they were well into the serious digging, and the rescue team began to realize that the combination of the intensity of the crash and 50 years of decay and scavenging would probably leave little chance of finding any identifiable human remains. Medical Officer Homer Tien and Lieutenant Colonel Martin Field, who specializes in forensic dentistry, were left to decide whether small remnants of bone could once have belonged to a Canadian airman.
Think?
Yeah, could be. The bone. Got a bone there. I got a piece of bone, small piece of bone.
Chief Warrant Officer Terry Sear has 30 years of experience with the military police.
Probably be the fifth one.
He would later admit that this single moment was one of the most moving of his career.
Yeah, my bag there.
Yes.
That
green bag?
One in, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, just put it inside that.
Okay.
Okay, where you see the other pieces.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll tag it after.
The discovery of the bones moved the intensity of the digging to another level as they searched for any other scraps, any clues, any tiny traces. And then, an amazing find. Master Corporal Steve Cruikshank found another watch.
We were just cleaving back sections of dirt and hoping to loosen up things that were in it, bone or personal effects. The watch popped out. I picked it up, said, "There's a watch." The Sergeant Major was beside me and I handed it off to him.
We found a watch. The inscription is Jim from Mum, 26/12/43.
The watch belonged to Jimmy Cox, the wireless operator who had just become a new father.
At first I didn't think much of it until Sergeant Major Vino turned it over, scraped the dirt off the back and read the inscription, Jim from Mom. At that point, we were all pretty happy. Mixed emotions, I guess, the best way to describe it. First it was, you know, God, we found something that we can identify and we can give to the family. Second was, Jim's a man just like me. Guy went down serving his country, and it just brings it all home. It's nice to know, though, that there's somebody around that'll come back. It could have been me. I'd like to think Canada treat me the same way.
I've been in the Army for 30 years now, and I've never had to fight. And it's because of these men that are lying here. My son is 22 years old, same age as many of these men here. And he has never had to fight, thank God. These men are heroes.
The discovery of the watch touched everyone. And now, even the Burmese officers started to join in the dig with the Canadians. They all knew that time was running out.
We moved the tail section over that way once already today. It took us about 2 days to move it, and now we're just going to roll it back this way and continue to dig on the other side. And in the pit here, we've probably gone down to a depth of about, a good 15, 16 feet at some points. And, you know, we've been working our way along the ditch, moving the soil as we go along, and we finally managed to move that part of the tail section. So we'll have a look under it and hope for the best. Don't anybody get underneath. Okay, keep going. Get a grip on the next part. Yeah! Good one.
I figure when the plane went down and that piece of jungle and those 6 people were killed, that little piece of jungle became part of Canada. Even though people won't be able to find it, it is a piece of our country there. That's the other thing in Bill's letters. He says about how proud they were that they're RCAF. Every one of them was proud to be a Canadian.
In truth, there was very little to recover of the 6 Canadians. 50 years in the jungle had taken care of that with brutal efficiency. But at least they could now finally confirm that the crew of KN 563 were no longer missing in action.
I hereby call a halt to this dig. Gather up your kit, move over here, prepare for the ceremony.
Burma, 52 years after KN 563 disappeared, families and wartime companions arrived to take part in the closing chapter of this saga, the official military burial of the aircrew, the final tribute to a fallen comrade, to a father he never met, to a long-lost brother.
My brother, when he used to go hunting across the arm, this arm of the harbor, which was frozen over with salt water ice, always very treacherous. And every Saturday, as it got dark, Bill wouldn't show up, and Mother would sit in the front window looking up the street, and sometimes he'd be an hour, 2 hours late, and she'd keep saying, "Oh, I wish he was home. I wish he was home." So now we say, he who has lost his home.
I'm proud of him. I'm extremely proud of him. Always have been.
Indeed, it is in the name of God that I ask His blessing be with all of these families. Oh God, we join together in this place and time to remember before you the crew members of Kilo November 563, who laid down their lives fighting for freedom and truth. We seek to commend their souls into your continued and gracious keeping, and to pray that we may be worthy of their sacrifice.
The families of crew KN 563 now had, at last, final closure. And in Perth, Ontario, unable to make the trip to Burma, Bill Kyle's brother George conducted his own private ceremony, but mostly for their mother, Edith.
Where's the watch, Mom? Wish I could have brought him with it. My mother will be happier now anyway. Yeah. She'll know where he is. Oh.
Commit their bodies to the ground, using soil from Canada, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
Thank you from Canada, who truly appreciates.
And for the baby boy whom Jimmy Cox would never meet, 52 years later, his father's watch.
Hey, sure do appreciate it. Thank you very much. On behalf of the Government of Canada, and especially this Veterans Affairs Recovery Team, I'd like you to be restored, as you're the rightful heir of this property. It makes me feel very proud to hand this back to you.
Great, I really thank you. Really do.
Thanks, sir.
Appreciate it.
Everyone would take away a special personal memory from the ceremony in Rangoon. But for the recovery team, who had crossed half a world and half a century, there would always be that private moment back in the jungle where they proclaimed that they did not break faith with those who died. And now, 6 Canadian heroes could forever sleep in their own field, far from Flanders.
In Flanders fields, poppies grow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, a lark still bravely singing flies, scarce heard amidst the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields.
Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep though poppies grow in Flanders field.